Dimitri.
Good evening. Good evening.
How you doing, Dimitri?
Oh, fantastic.
Oh, good.
I'm trying to uncover the truth of the immortal soul.
Oh, well, that's good. All in a day's work. I'm glad. So have you discovered the immortal soul yet? Good to see you, Mr. Murphy. Was it located under your staircase like the Alpha in the Borges story, where you fell in the basement and found it like lurking there and could see all of space and time as once? Was that where it was in the attic?
I haven't looked there yet. I'll have to see.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good guess for where the immortal soul can be found. Under the
It's
staircase in the
crazy.
attic. That's usually where you store things and forget about them. So that's quite lovely. I see. I look forward to your talk with the Dark Renaissance. Raven Michelle said it was lovely, so I look forward to it. This is wedding season, so I'll be unloading chairs this evening. What have you been thinking about, Dimitri? What's been on your mind? Because I'm just going to talk about how I've been going through Stiglitz on globalization, all of the economists. And honestly, at the end of that, Rothbard, and as just a little note, at the end of the day, it seems like all the economists cancel one another out. It really does. Like they all like negate each other. And I wonder if like economics has been stuck in one-sidedness for the last 2 centuries, basically, because it ultimately like Stiglitz is like, well, globalization doesn't seem to work because the IFM bank cannot allocate resources correctly. But then Keynes comes along and he's like, well, without stimulus, you lose demand and the economy collapses. And then Haidt comes along and he's like, well, looks like stimulus doesn't work the more advanced the economy is. And then, people like him also say the government can't coordinate resources, von Mises, human action. And at the end of the day, after everyone talks, it sounds like the economy is something that without demand collapses and we have no ability to stimulate it in first world nations. So then the question becomes, what is economics if that's all it can do? And I think it gets actually into where we need to look more into something like a Taleb or even a George Soros when he talks about reflexivity, where economics is all about skill and discernment. But it's really funny to me to think that, like, it just seems to me like I read, when you read, like Rothbard makes a lot of good points about how Keynesianism doesn't work. But then Keynes makes a whole lot of really good points about how market equilibrium doesn't exist. And so it just seems like they all cancel each other out at the end of the day. But that's what I've been thinking about. I'd be curious about what you've been thinking about. And then also Mr. Murphy there. So Dimitri, what's been on your mind?
Yeah, first of all, I have some comments on what you said
Please.
there, because in the history of philosophy we get something like this too, right? Like Hegel emerged as also someone who critiqued Schelling. So you could say Hegel and Schelling cancel each other out. Now, I I don't remember exactly the story, but Hegel said something like that philosophy is an epoch grasped in thought, right? A time grasped in thought. So, like this very canceling out says something as a contradiction that is alive. So that's for one thing. But I cannot say anything about it because I'm not read on the subject matter at all. So what have I been thinking about? Yeah, I'm basically getting back to Plato, and I'm reading the Protagoras now, which is quite interesting. Just finished the Phaedrus and some other the Gorgias and stuff like this, and I really like Plato's letter 7. There's multiple letters which he supposedly wrote. I don't To me, like letter 8, for example, I don't know if he wrote this really, and there's also like scholars who disagree if he really wrote that one. But letter 7 is established to be truly Plato. So as far as we know, it's probably him. And from the little I know about him, it does really seem like it could have been written by Plato. So letter 7 is basically him writing a letter talking about his experience in Sicily, because there was a Dionysius the second was a king in Sicily, and he wanted and he had like a nephew, Dion, and Dion really believed in Plato's teachings, and eventually there was all kinds of political things going down. But actually, the politics don't even interest me the most of letter 7. I find these comments that Plato has about writing interesting, because Plato says, I will never write a treatise, I will never write my teachings down. I just want to have a few people who are trained and initiate them into the teachings. He also says something like, when everyone's like he talks about Sicily, and that in Sicily back in those days, people lived such a luxurious life. Of course, not the slaves and not the women generally, more like the elite. But he says, how can, like, they never slept alone in their bed. They always had lots of wine and dinners and feasts. And he says, how can a man become wise in such an environment? It's impossible. And then he goes on talking about how when everyone's like partying and having sex and indulging in themselves, you should like use your leisure time to read and to write. And it's so funny how like there's people always like to say that the day and age in we're living is really special, it's really different. Now is the crisis, now is the chance, now is the opportunity, now it's the culmination of world history. Kind of like the way that people critique Hegel for the notion of the end of history, because usually they don't really go through to the extent to really grasp like what is he actually getting at there. But people do pretend that like we are at the verge, at the end of the history. Whereas if you go back and read things that are so old by the ancients, there's so much similarities. One of the things Plato talks about is how the multitude or the masses will extol it as virtuous to basically have a lot of sex with a lot of people. And that's still the case, right? Like these kinds of things are still very much the case. So those I found very interesting from Plato's Letter 7. And yeah, I find the word purification very interesting. In the Sophist, Plato will talk about purification as consisting of nothing but refutation. So Socrates basically went out to different places, having this idea that I know nothing. And he wanted to bring people to that standpoint, not because he just wanted to deconstruct everything, but because he knew that that's the starting point from which we can start to do philosophy. Which has like, isn't that exactly what Hegel's getting at, albeit in a different way, with absolute knowing? Like you gotta be refuted, so you are basically self-empty to the extent that you can actually begin constructing again. So yeah, these are the things that I've been some of the things I've been thinking about.
Well, I appreciate you sharing a few things. First, I know Justin Murphy had that interesting study with the Plato scholar who talked about Letter 7, and it's on his channel, Other Life, I believe. That was very interesting. He also just talked about how politically and socially savvy Plato was as well, which is quite an interesting topic that I was unaware of. And you know, a number of the things that you were saying, also, I really appreciated the scene of Mr. Murphy driving on the road and the road ahead. It really made me think of some good, like, country music. So that was really cool. So thank you, Mr. Murphy. You know, it also makes me think it's very interesting because there's always that. So first off, there's always this tension, right, between, oh, things are different this time. And one of the econ books I just finished, Renhoff and the other individual is called This Time is Different. And, you know, and they go through economic history and show, no, it's never different. It's always the same. Basically, credit expansion, over leverage in the debt markets, blow up, redo. And every single freaking time, everyone claims, well, this time it's going to, like, what are they talking about right now in 2023? It's going to be a no landing recession. You know, like there's not going to be a recession because this time the Federal Reserve actually did it. They actually timed the rates and so on. No, it's never like that. And yet at the same time, there's enough difference to make it plausible to people that this time it's different. And that's what's really interesting to me, like how over and over again in economic history, you can have a repetition that strikes people as not being a repetition. And that's precisely why it repeats. Hello, Chetan. Good to see you, my friend. So what is it about human nature that is so able to convince itself that this time it's different? Because you see this like in econ history over and over again. It's the same business cycle and they go way back. It's not just modern economic history. They go way back. And it's basically following someone like him and Minsky, except Steve King, the Australian economist, so on and so forth. It's just over and over again. And history has a similar thing. Now, there's also a danger, and then I'll give it back to you, Dimitri, in being like, nothing changes because, you know, I know Bard emphasizes information technologies, and that seems valid. The world does seem dramatically shifted by the printing press, the internet. But then also, there's something fundamental about human beings that doesn't shift, even if there's some kind of shift in how, William Ong talks about how the brain changes after the printing press. Now we can do scientific treatise. So I'm always interested, like there's two things I'm always interested in. How do we describe the way history repeats and it not be naive, simplistic? And likewise, how do we talk about progress that's not naive? Because there's also this kind of idea that, oh, things are getting better. And there's one sense in which that seems to be true, but then in another sense where that seems to be naive. So what's the correct way to talk about these different things? I think it's economically very relevant. There's a way in which we say, well, history is better because of technology. I can use a laptop, right? Well, everything has trade-offs. So what is the function of the word better? What is the function of the word repeat when we talk about history? And then the last thing I'll say that's so interesting too is, you're talking about how people use their leisure to consume and to have sex and not really be productive. And there's about 10,000 stink beetles in my office because it's that time of year in Virginia. So if one flies into my mouth and you hear me scream at the top of the lungs, it's because a stink bug has flown into my mouth, just so you know. But with Keynes, there's this big debate where people are like, Keynes, buddy, if you always stimulate, if you always bail people out, and actually Keynes is a little more nuanced. So let's just say modern monetary theory people, which people would associate with Keynesianism. But they're like, guys, if you always stimulate the economy, you basically never reward the people who save their money, don't overly leverage, don't overly spend. And those are actually the people you want to kind of move into positions of power. If the economy comes down, they can buy the cheap prices, they can buy out the company and so on and so forth. If you continue to stimulate the economy artificially, then you're never going to have that changeover, and you're actually going to incentivize a culture that doesn't say use their leisure to study and things like that. Well, then someone like Keynes or Keene or whatever, they come along and say, yeah, that's all well and good, but if we don't stimulate the economy, the whole thing's going to collapse. And what Keynes was so concerned about is social unrest. A lot of people don't like the main thing he's concerned. If you have like demand drives up, the economy sucks, that's when a strong man comes to power. And that's what he's really concerned about. So it's very interesting to think in economic history that the conditions that reward a use of leisure that is perhaps more philosophical might economically be the same condition in which a strong man comes to power. And that if you don't do that, the economy continues to actually service speculation and bad economic activity. What does it mean? And it's an interesting question. What does it mean that the same social condition that tends to almost reward people who use their leisure well might economically be the very condition that leads to great unrest and makes a strong man appealing? And looking back on economic history, that almost very often seems to be the case. I don't want to say always, but that they seem to go together. And of course, this is where we can make the point about the Chinese character, for catastrophe being opportunity and different things. But it's very interesting that the same kind of social condition that rewards a constructive use of leisure may be the very condition of social unrest in which strong men come to power. So these are a bunch of thoughts. Feel free to reply to any of them, anyone.
What you said about the times of crisis when a strong man has a big likelihood to come into power is also the time for philosophy to happen. Well, isn't this exactly aligned with Hegel's thinking that I've kind of been mentioning in the net too? That's that's really fascinating. There's I want to mention some things more from my research into Plato. One of the things that I really like about the net, and in general our extended kind of network here, our Philosophy Portal 2, is that it's really in the spirit of a common search for truth. Whereas what I found, and it's not always the case, there's a lot of great academic philosophers, but is sometimes when you go speak someone from academia or to such an event, there's not really the possibility for this common search of truth in open dialogue. And I'll just give one example because it's quite funny. I talk about it too in our podcast on the channel, our latest one. Is that I went to this Girard study circle in the Netherlands, and this is it's an organization funded by Peter Thiel, by people who knew Girard personally and translated his book to Dutch and stuff. It was very nice to be there and to learn from them. And at a certain point, there was this woman. She wasn't actually a member of that organization, but she had a talk, and she was a theologian, a professor. And in her talk, she kept using the words ontology and theology. So me being me, at the end of the talk, I asked her, okay, but what do you actually mean by ontology and theology? And she looked at me with this yeah, with unpleasant face saying, "Oh, you should study philosophy," but being quite insulted by the fact that I would ask such a question, and that was really fascinating to me because she also mentioned the fact that academics are always in ivory towers, and I asked her, "Okay, can you give an example?" And she couldn't. To me, that shows maybe she knows herself to be in that position, but she kind of keeps it at a distance, you know. But yeah, it's interesting to go into it as an anthropological study. I didn't mean to offend her, but yeah, there to have this common search for truth necessitates this openness that yeah, that can be lost if disciplines are institutionalized in certain ways. So yeah, another thing I wanted to mention is that so yeah, philosophy, just take my argument for the sake of it. Philosophy emerges at the time of crisis, and then in Plato's life we get the Parmenides, which both Hegel and Lacan deemed as like the best example of the ancient dialectic, right? So Zizek will argue that in the Sophist, Plato does similar types of movements. He talks about being and non-being, and it's really amazing. It's an amazing text. I highly recommend reading the Sophist because he really goes to the core of like a lot of paradoxes laying there, and the problem of monism, but also of dualism, of motion, rest, being, non-being, all these kinds of categories. And then suddenly going through all those types of paradoxes, which are super rich in a food for thought, even in this day and age, especially in this day and age, then he's like, well, motion and rest have to partly participate in being. And therefore, there's a kind of distinction that goes on. And then he's like, okay, there's also, yeah, so there's being, non-being, motion, and rest. There's two other categories I don't remember. But first, he goes through a rigorous dialectic. Then he kind of gives up. He says, well, okay, actually, non-being is not the opposite of being. Non-being is just an other to being. And it's not, in my words, a substantial other to being, but it's just a predicated other to being. So instead of like there being something like void or nothingness as such, it's just the negation of some type of predicate. So like, let's say the non-being of the apple in my hand, you know, it's negated, but there's not a non-being as such. And Zizek makes the argument that if you read Parmenides and the Sophist is actually Plato taking a step back from his own radicality that he got into in the Parmenides. And Parmenides, as is theorized, is located in the middle period, whereas the Sophist is located in a later period. And also you'll get something similar, Zizek argues, with Schelling, who was really the most radical in his middle period and then kind of backed down from this. So that's something I wanted to mention. Feel free to respond to that. And Daniel, because I'm so ignorant on the question of economics, I want to ask a few questions. And they're gonna be naive questions because that's good entry points, I think. First of all, like when I think about economics, I immediately think about politics and also the rottenness of our institutions. Like take the American political, like federal system, right? It's definitely overdetermined by lobbyists. That much is clear, whether you vote Democrat or Republican. So what does, you know, is there some kind of basis that politicians use for their economic policy that's grounded in any kind of rigorous theory from maybe the 20th century earlier or whatever? Like, how should we think about the relationship between the implementation of economic theory and the institution of the American government or the state? And also, like, I guess I have a lot of questions about financial capital, because I've heard that today most money in the system is actually like financial capital, and then it's virtual. It doesn't really do anything or something like that. So if you could respond to, I think you understand what I'm trying to question here.
Oh, it's an excellent question. I'll pass it to Chetan. Mr. Luber, good to see you. So a few things. First off, what you said about the academic, I actually think you see a similar thing in business. If a guy has a new idea for a product or way to innovate and he comes to the boss, he's like, yeah, whatever, buddy, and get out of the way. Like, there is something about human beings that don't want to have to think foundationally. Because if a company introduces a new product, what if that like has a new business model? Maybe it would be valuable to do that, but they don't want to do it. And it's actually very interesting. Like, when you ask people, what do you mean by ontology? It can be horrifying, because what if they've forgotten and they've just been using it and the definition is wrong? Oh my gosh, everything may tear down. And I think you see that. And I, from experience, can speak to the horror of going, of having basically over 15 years revisiting Keynes and realizing so many times, oh my gosh, I misunderstood the theory of probability. All those papers suck. I have to rewrite them. Oh my gosh, I misunderstand his argument. I have to redo them. Oh my gosh, there's not really a money multiplier in Keynes. It's an investment multiplier. Oh my gosh. And there is a horror in that. But if you don't face that horror, then you do give up the pursuit of truth. I think that's the price. The pursuit of truth is terrifying, precisely because you realize a lot of things that you thought you knew, you misread or thought. Like, there have been so many things that I thought were established fact that I've repeated, and then someone brought up to my attention that it wasn't true. And I was like, oh my gosh, what else have I assumed from other people or was taught is true and it's not? And it's
I just want to respond to this very quickly, because
Please.
now I'm writing this paper for the Science of Logic anthology, and today I was just sitting scratching my head thinking, okay, but I don't know, I don't actually know anything. Like, what the fuck am I doing?
That's why, but that's the feel. Like, that's where, though, why you can see people in philosophy move away from the pursuit of truth to the institutional, because the main thing the institutional and the specialization can protect you from is that abyssal experience. Because you say, well, this is my specialty, this is my interpretation, and you're kind of saved. But it also goes to show you, when you're doing philosophy in that way, it's different in character. It does require existential facing, and it's terrifying, but in a good way. It's a different kind of philosophy. Now, that's an open question, because I want to address the economic questions you brought up. But I think what you were getting at is very, very important. And I think if philosophy doesn't have that kind of abyssal possibility, then it's not the right kind of philosophy. Likewise, the same applies to economics. Once economics uses monopoly power or state power to keep out creative destruction or entrepreneurs or to keep the financial system, then it denies the abyssal foundation of it that I'm locating in demand, as we talked about last week, which I really, really enjoyed. It wants to keep that out, because if it asks, well, what exactly is demand? Boom. Because right now, the political system does have theories of economics that they operate according to that I would argue you deconstruct if you look closely at demand. So the key one, conservatives are going to follow market equilibrium, and liberals are going to follow something more like Keynesianism or modern monetary theory. In modern monetary theory, let me put it in America. Now, you have to go country by country, but let me just very quickly say, in conservatism, the key notion of market equilibrium is that unemployment takes care of itself if you basically get out of the way. If unemployment is an anomaly in the market, and that it should naturally go away, because wherever there is a desire for employment, there would be a good that would correspond that. So a general way to put this, now von Mises has a different view of equilibrium. So everyone has different views. Neoclassical is different. But the general thing I would say is that conservative thought is going to have an emphasis on a theory of equilibrium, okay? Now, I don't agree with that theory, but that's kind of the argument that they follow, and it's very axiomatic. Now, the modern monetary theory is going to emphasize things like really going to put emphasis on liquidity flow, and maintaining liquidity flow through government spending or Federal Reserve and different things like that. And they really want to argue that inflation is not a big deal, especially if you're printing money in your own currency, because you are printing money in your own currency. Like, debt is not a fundamental problem. Here's why. It's kind of what you were saying with the financialism. Debt equals money. Every time you get into debt, you're likewise creating money, right? So that stimulates investment that then backs that debt. So it becomes a kind of feedback loop that pays for itself. Now, that's not all of liberal thought. If you go back in US history, there are different economic theories that different people follow. I would argue that American conservatism, the Republican Party was a lot more libertarian 20 years ago. They're not as libertarian now. I would argue that 20 years ago, Democrats were much more FDR based. They're not so much now. So it does vary. There are economic theories for their policy. My argument would be it's very similar to institutional philosophy, where you're actually avoiding the true pursuit of what creates, like you're saying, the pursuit of truth. I agree with. I would say that a lot of economic theory actually avoids the question, what is value and what actually is the foundation of the economy? Because I would argue that unveils, just like in sociology, a kind of Gödel fundamental incompleteness point, which we talked about last time that Chetan was talking about that we all enjoyed, was that there's this fundamental non-economic basis that makes economic possible. And if you take that seriously, in my opinion, you get a model of economics where you need to stimulate demand and you can't. So it's a very, very dismal view of economics if you poke on that demand problem, unless you can cultivate some sort of change in the human character to favor creativity, the Nietzschean child, the artifacts, the spread of those conditions. Well, no one in history has ever figured out how to do that. So it's understandable why economics would kind of push that out of consideration, because why even bother to talk about it if no one could address it? Well, I'm of the opinion if you can't address it, you can't overcome the problem of the great stagnation that Tyler Cohn talks about that first world nations fall into. Like the time is up. Like we've been able in economics to basically do dialectical reasoning, one-sidedness, if you will, back and forth, back and forth. No, now you have to move to speculative reason per se. You have to get into an entirely different logic by which you think of economics, and it's going to be far more integrative and terrifying as a result. But it's necessary. If we do not, then what's going to happen is increasing efforts to stimulate demand will fail. As they fail, there will be more and more inflation. You'll have greater income inequality. You'll have more and more social tension, just like Keynes feared. In every nation will have different strategies relative to that. One of the most common things to occur for a government to do is, as their own country domestically falls apart, they begin fighting another enemy to unify their people with that scapegoat mechanism. And that's very common. And so things like conflict, war, all of these things become very likely. But then, of course, if the Austrians come along and say, well, we need to get government out of the way, and that would fix everything, well, the debt levels are so high that if the government got out of the way, it would bankrupt everything. So you have a very, very problematic situation that seems to only be resolvable by an incubation of value creation, ergo creativity, which no one has ever figured out how to do. And those, to me, are the stakes. More can be said, but I will pass it on to Chetan and Mr. Luber to respond to any of that. Chetan, it is good to see you, my friend. I hope you are doing well. I must say, gentlemen, since I've been working on all this economic stuff last week, I took so many notes and has been integrating them in. Chetan, I referenced you like 5 times, so thank you, sir. So I appreciate these conversations. They're wonderful.
So, every time each week I get into this discussion with Daniel about economics, and especially today, I remember a long time back, a decade back almost, I started working on thinking about economics as a philosophical problem. And I tried to sort of construct a, book proposal around it a long way back. And what happens is each time I start thinking about it, I start thinking how much I've forgotten what I did at that time. Things I read, Carl Schmitt, I was reading Foucault at that time, so on and so forth. And I've almost forgotten most of what, I remember bits and pieces of what I read at that moment. And I never completed that book. I never wrote that, went through that project in some way because of various reasons. But anyway, I think so just keep in mind that when I'm saying upon these topics, I'm talking from a very patchy memory upon reading these But I think this question of economics with strongman tendencies, this linking and with the Keynesian question of state, is extremely interesting. And I think maybe if we try and develop it to some degree, because we can't develop it in this space, in any thorough manner, of course, because of the various complications that come with these kind of questions. But if we honestly ask ourselves, economics comes to the center of statecraft post-sovereign power starts sort of moving away or shifting away. You move away from kings and queens and so on and so forth, and you start entering into what you may call modern state. Foucault sort of terms this transition as movement from sovereign power to disciplinary biopolitical power. That's a language he gives. I'm not interested in the Foucauldian analysis of that problem, although I think Foucault is very interesting. But I'm just sort of interested in making that transition sort of, giving a language to that transition is very important. That what is it about sovereignty that didn't allow economics to come to center in the same manner? As sovereignty started getting dissolved into the social, economics started becoming a central theme. I think that's one of the questions I personally struggled with at that time in that sense. I think second sort of question is that once we sort of agree to this kind of friction, if I may use that word, or at least a form of antagonism between a certain form of sovereign structures and state emerges in that antagonism. State is not something which is immediately a sovereign structure in that sense. If the way you think about sovereignty pre-state, in that state emerges from a certain kind of ability to dissolve sovereignty or at least dissipate it in society. Break it in smaller portions, separate it out. That is why you think about state as something having multiple heads, in Hydra and so on. So kind of metaphors come in, which of state can in some senses break this kind of sovereign, and economics sort of emerges within this kind of a matrix of thinking. And what is interesting with Keynes, at least, was that economics for a long time tried to argue that it can function without the state. State is needed for it to be functioning automatically. And Keynes in his brilliant way, and I think before that, Keynes sort of gave a theory to argue that economics is not possible without the state. That's I think the central theme with Keynes that comes philosophically, at least, that's what interested me a lot. That in what ways economics sort of was never possible without a certain re-emergence of the sovereign question. Somebody had to make certain decisions, and state comes into picture, stimulation comes into picture, and those kind of discussions that you were having comes back. And I think that matrix becomes interesting. That economics needs something like state to function. It's not something that can function automatically. It was never functioning automatically. Those are myths. There were always decisions taken, concrete decisions taken by concrete actors. And how were those decisions acted out? What were the concrete conditions in which something became a sovereign in the certain situation? Those questions sort of, I think, Keynes sort of, and Keynes tried to give a theory, what is the role that state can play? And of course, Keynes' theory sort of goes against how economics needs to be thought of in isolation of the state. For example, in isolation of the state, we think about saving money, we think about, planning for the future and so on and so forth. And Keynes sort of realizes very fast that those kind of activities are in some senses opposite to what state expects for a certain kind of economic boom. It's fascinating that what actually works for this collective economic functioning to sort of work is something that goes against the individual decision making for his own interest. In that sense, so if you're thinking about saving money, if you're thinking about for your own self in a private sense, modern economics doesn't function in that manner. There's something that fails there completely. So the question becomes, given these facts, and I'm not sort of right now going to theorize it, I'm just given these facts, now how do we thinking about the problem of economics? And my sort of one suggestion here would be that one of the major mistakes we make is we think economics we of course think of economics in relationship with politics. What we miss is the Machiavellian turn. We don't think of economics in relationship to violence. One of the reasons why we can't have a concrete theory of value, for instance, questions of demand, is we don't realize that modern economics emerged in the context of a certain sort of a race towards competing, having certain kind of claim over resources in that sense. It emerged in relationship to war. It also replaced war in certain situations. It also extended war and became a part of war. And we don't have that memory right now. But if you go back and look at the colonial history, we'll get it very clearly that modern economics was shaped by colonial, movements taking place. And I think Hannah Arendt in her book on violence sort of gets it right to that extent. That violence actually, and today also when countries think about economics, they don't think simply in terms of how high our GDP will go, how value will create. They think of it in terms of how strategically they'll be in superior position vis-a-vis other countries. There is that question of war at the back of it, which sort of guides economic thinking, which you're not ready to accept. You don't want to openly say it, but that relationship of war is guiding the economic thinking process. And how do we think through that? I think Daniel can at least help us think through some of these questions. Yeah.
Well, you're very kind, and I hope you feel better. And it's funny you mentioned doing an econ project that you weren't turned to in a long time, because that's how it's been for me. Because like all of these works, and I had all these papers on hike and different things. I'm going back. It's like, oh my gosh, that was from 2009. So there's something, but it's funny, you know, you said so many insanely important things. First off, I think I really like what you're saying about considering the history of the relation of state and sovereignty and how they're not actually necessarily equivalent. That's a very good insight, and I think we have to follow that. That's really good. I think also it's very important to realize that this idea of economics without a state, it is a myth. There are some, like, Hike straight up said laissez-faire economics is insane. Like, people you think believed in a hard libertarian view of economics did not. Adam Smith did not. Hike did not. I don't even like the big mistake that people make is they think a critique of government intervention is the same as a critique of government regulation. Those are not necessarily the same. Like, I think von Mises is mostly targeting government intervention. Now, he tends to say that most regulation that's called regulation is intervention in disguise, but he's not naive and to say that the state should have no laws. You don't have, I call it the myth of autonomous freedom. You don't have this idea that if you just give people freedom, magically wealth comes from nowhere. If that was the case, then we would expect the richest places to be the Amazon guy in the forest who, you know, is by himself, right? We don't see that. The key is what has happened is a conflation of regulation and intervention that are not necessarily the same, but a lot of conservative people conflate those. It is quite clear that a game of football is only possible with the rules of football, with referees, right? We may hate the refs, we may think they make bad calls, but if there are no rules or refs, there is no football. It is the rules. And so you have to have the setup of that structure. Now, you have to go policy by policy by policy to determine what is regulation and what is intervention sometimes, and that becomes very difficult. And there are strong critiques to be made of governments being very inefficient and of taxes coming to be a fourth branch of government the government uses for special interests. Okay, though you can talk about all that, but that's different from saying no state involvement at all. And I think that is indeed a myth that has been very problematic. And it's basically also been justified by an idea of market equilibrium that has likewise not been so simplistically defended, because even in von Mises, something like equilibrium is something that you strive toward, but it's not an actual state. It's a notion of entrepreneurials seeking equilibrium, but equilibrium is not a self-organizing principle of market activity. There's all these different nuances that are very important. The other thing is what you're saying about war. That's 100%. The Cold War, you know, the Cold War didn't really end. It just moved from nukes to debt. It's just debt deterrence now instead of nuke deterrence, basically, although that seems to be shifting too, unfortunately. You know, what's very interesting is it's almost like the only one that seems to be explicit about it, although I haven't read his works in a long time other than the biotech one, is Fukuyama in The End of History. He's basically explicit about the idea that economics is the new form of war. And that's a good thing, though, because it's not going to kill us all. It will address people's thymos, their need for status and conflict, and it will address eros, because Fukuyama is actually more classically trained. He's not, you know, I may disagree with him, but he's not like naive about different things. But he also is kind of like, basically the way to read The End of History is where he's like, if economics can't be the new form of war, we're screwed, so it better. You know, the Washington Consensus has to work because the only alternative is going back to real war, and they're more in big trouble. Well, Fukuyama, I'm afraid it doesn't work. In the same way that I'm afraid Keynesians, although I completely agree, and I shouldn't say Keynes because he's been so misrepresented. He's much more nuanced. But the idea of government stimulus, it is quite clear that its effectiveness wears off, that you can only stimulate demand for so long. And yet I believe there is a demand event horizon. Well, what does that mean? We're in trouble. we've got I call it the hard problem of economics. We've got to work this through. And I think it is a philosophical problem. I 100% agree. And actually, as a final note, one of the reasons perhaps the hard problem of economics has not been addressed, I called it the hard problem of demand because that's where I located, is because if politicians admitted that, then they would actually lose some power. But if the conservatives can say, no, equilibrium works, and if the liberals can say, no, stimulus works, then it becomes a legitimacy for their political power. And so I think there's an ideology move here to maintain power, to not admit the hard problem of demand or the hard problem of economics. Because if you did that, the politicians would have to be like, yeah, we actually can't do much about that. Well, then everyone would be like, well, screw you then. They would lose a whole lot of power, right? So instead we get stuck in this back and forth dialectical one-sidedness, and we don't get to the hard problem of economics, which I do think has a lot to do with this issue of violence. There's more to be said. I appreciated the Foucault and everything you brought up, but let me give it to Mr. Luber and then back to Chetan. And Mr. Murphy has made it to the other side of the yellow brick road, and he's visiting the wizard now. But Mr. Luber, please.
Wowie. Okay. First, I just wanted to say an idea that I have with what I feel like what you could do, and Chetan and Dimitri and a lot of people in this space. I feel like there could be like a question hall, honestly, where it's just like you guys are just like there on the Zoom and people just pop up and have questions to ask you guys, honestly, because it's just the amount of people you've read is like unreal. I feel like like you guys just read all these different topics. It's crazy to me. I can't keep up, I feel like. But I have a few things to say. First, I guess a question. And I've been thinking about this, Daniel, with regard to like my own project too. If everybody, like you're talking about the Nietzschean child, if everybody becomes the child, then what happens to the child? Like if everybody becomes, thematically oriented, what happens to theme at that point? To me, like if everybody becomes the child or like thematically oriented, an opening occurs where a new horizon line of what it means to be a child will emerge. So with that said, it seems like whatever the truth is moving. So it seems like the aim of the philosopher is more trying with their eye to trace the movement of truth. Kind of like when you talk about like the comet and the you know what I'm talking about, the remnants of the comet that you see. I guess that has to do with the hard problem, because demand in a sense is constantly moving, like truth, and you kind of have to follow whatever that demand is, and that means you have to face being wrong. You have to face just being just absolutely incorrect, like you were talking about earlier, like, oh, I misread this. Like you have to take ownership of being wrong. And it's actually, to me, a lot easier. It's a lot easier to be wrong than it is to like constantly maintain being right. So it's funny that that's even like a thing where people feel a need to not be wrong. But and then when you're talking about the state and economics and with government, it reminds me of, so the state is propped up by the stakes in which the government can unify and be a government. So to me, a government is just a type of amalgamation of stakes unfolding in a certain way that makes the government be the government. So the question to me then is, what is stakes? Like, what are stakes? And again, you run into the same issue, which is stakes move. Like the stakes are constantly moving in an everyday fashion, and it's very much based on that feedback loop. So in my mind, it just comes down to how people can understand their everyday based off of a condition that is beyond the everyday and yet is present in that everyday. And to me, that's theme, lack, you could call it what you like. But the problem that I'm like running into is if everybody is operating under a condition that is following this movement of truth, then how are people even following this movement? How are you able to create this real, metaphysical demand if it seems to entail that not everyone follows it? Like, it seems to entail that if everybody's following it, then in a certain sense, you can't possibly be following it. Like, because it entails there being this like new, different horizon line that always occurs. So therefore, it's like you're always following behind it. So in that sense, there's like, in my mind, like almost like a pecking order of like who's closer to following it than others. Like it seems like there's like a hierarchy of who's closer to who's farther away. And because there's this like spectrum, this hierarchy, so to speak, it seems like you can't actually move an entire, civilization into having a demand because not everyone's on the same page because there's a hierarchy. So I hope my my thinking out loud and my question makes sense, but I'm just genuinely curious because it for me, it's like with storytellers, it's like it almost seems I almost need people to not understand theme. Like I kind of need it, and if everyone understands it, then it's like, well, then what is it again? So I don't know.
First off, you're very kind. Second, Tyler Murphy, I'm glad you came back from the void. Third, the question you're asking is very good. So here's the question. What is the kind of change that is being described? I'll use the information technology. Is there a hierarchy? Can you compare the people before the printing press and the people after the printing press in terms of how they are toward the world and how they are organized? Yes, no, because there's also kind of just a radical transformation in how consciousness is structured if we take William Ong seriously. Can you compare someone who's worked with the internet for a really long time with someone who has not? Or is it now like a change in kind? Now, there are hierarchies perhaps in the people who follow that kind, who have their brain work in X or Y way, but it might not be adequate to say, oh, the people after the internet are better than the people before the internet because there's been a shift in kind. So what it seems to have occurred, this would be the argument, is that the spread of childhood is a change in kind of the nature of the economic participant, not merely a degree of the pre-existing or currently existing economic participant. So for example, now that's a massive claim. So right now I would say that we do not have an economy that thinks in terms of internal coordination, simply price side coordination. So if you had a spreading of people that were also taking into account evaluation of internal coordination, it would be a different kind that may address the problem of creating demand without it being a zero-sum game, because it's a change of kind, actually. Now, that will require me to argue, this all leads actually into like cone dynamics, spiral dynamics, and how we misunderstand all of that. And actually, spiral dynamics is not supposed to be some spiritual evolution, but an evolutionary response to an environment, and that coordinates developmentalism versus not. And can you have a developmental in the human consumer that can make a meaningful distinction between lack and scarcity, and then see value in coordinating according to lack? That's a different kind of economic participant. And yes, there may be hierarchy relative to that economic participant, but it's possible to change everyone who is currently not that kind of economic participant into that kind of economic participant, address the problem, and then you can have your new hierarchy relative to that different kind of consumer, if you will, and avoid the problems that we are describing while not having the zero-sum game problem of all that you are describing. Now, what you've identified is a very real problem, and that's why we have to be talking in a change of kind of person. Like a child is not, like to talk about the Nietzschean child is not really on the same gradient as, say, people are now. That's someone who makes values by their own standards, their own individuation, and that by definition doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. Now we get into resource distribution, and that's why we have to talk about price coordination in different things. But I'm saying a lot, and I'm going to pass it to Chetan and Dimitri, but the problem I do think can be addressed because we're talking about a change in kind, of which then there can be hierarchical coordination relative to that. But then the nature of that hierarchy doesn't actually have to be zero sum. It could be non-zero sum where everybody wins, all ships rise together. I see you've unmuted. I'll let you say something. Because we're talking about the creation of one's own values. And if we follow how innovation spreads in an economy, if I create, say, a new kind of toaster, everyone can benefit from it, not just me. So there's a question of the nature of that information distribution. That was a ton of things that I said very quickly. Mr. Luber, please.
So like, I understand what you're saying when you're saying a change of kind, but the through line of kind is like that self-knowledge of what kind you were before in a certain sense. So to me, that's very quantifiable, like almost too quantifiable, where it's like if in today's world, it's not like super quantifiable. How do you become a billionaire? Like, it's like almost like if a billionaire in that terminology would be someone who knows how to change their kind or knows what it means to morph into kinds, different kinds. That to me would be the equivalent to like being a billionaire, like just compiling money and understanding how the money got there kind of thing. Maybe I'm wrong for that comparison, but it's like, I don't see there being like a straightforward way of understanding how to become a billionaire. Like you could talk about ways in which you can know yourself and, you know, it could trigger somebody to figure out, you know, different notions about themselves and whatnot. But it just seems like way more rudimentary and like easier in a certain respect. Like it's like harder to maybe initially do, but once you start thinking in a certain way, it just becomes like almost like pathological for yourself in a way. Like, you know, once you start thinking about lack, it's like, how do you not think about lack? So yeah, it's the same thing with the billionaire. It's like when the billionaire is like, oh, you fuck people over in this way, and that's how I make my billions. That's like, how do I not think like that? How do I not continue to compound in that type of directionality? So I guess my question really is, if you're operating in a world where that's like the commodity, essentially, a changing kind, wouldn't that be too accessible in a way? Like, it seems like everybody, like not everybody has the possibility of being a billionaire, but it seems like everybody has the possibility of changing their kind. Like everybody has that deep down, I would think. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's my question.
It's a fair question. I'll pass it to Chetan and Dimitri. There is a question of if it is inherently bad, if it's quantifiable, especially if quantification requires qualification first, because there has to be qualities that you are quantifying. So the other thing that would kind of arise is it is possible. So is it possible for everyone to have the internet and be changed by the experience of the internet and how they're toward the world and how they think? Yes. Does that mean that the fact that everyone is affected by the internet, does that lessen or dilute the impact that everyone else is affected by the internet? It's trade-offs. I'm not saying that it's always good or bad, right? Likewise, if you have a system that makes present internal coordination, because I think you just described the billionaire is internally coordinated to then have a habit of getting more and more money to the point that it's problematic, the same thing can happen to the philosopher. They get in a habit of doing philosophy and doing that kind of internal coordination, right? Is that inherently bad? Not necessarily. In fact, it could be very good, right? It just depends. But the very awareness, the entire framing you just put forth of is one of internal coordination. That is not an economic framing. And the argument is we need to think in terms of those economic framings. I'm not saying there are no economists who aren't aware of the problem of internal coordination, but the moment you start talking about economics as having the billionaire has an internal coordination that is making them a billionaire, you have now moved into a realm that is usually outside of economics to talk about why economic activity occurs. And to talk about a change in kind would be a kind of economics that is thinking in those terms, thinking in habit construction, thinking about the ways that people are internally coordinated and saying, hey, the effect, now that would be something to do with incentives, but the problem is we've moved entirely away from incentives that have anything to do with internal coordination and then determine the value of incentives relative to GDP. So you have a particular metric by which those incentives are organized that leave outside of it this question of internal coordination. What would it look like to do that alternative? I've said a lot, there's more to say, but the point you're getting at is very valid. But I would argue that the framing that you put forth is, as a whole, a framing of internal coordination, which I would like basically people to do what you just did. Like, if economists were to do what you just did, that would be the beginning of the shift. And that isn't, I think, how people do things. Now, I think classical, like Adam Smith certainly did. Lord have mercy, Adam Smith did. And some of the great, dare I say, economists did. But that is not what we do now. And I think that that leaves things to be desired and leaves the problem of demand unaddressed. I think it also might have, I'll comment on the violence as well, because there's something here, but I'm going to pause and wait. Let me give it to Chetan and Dimitri. And just so I do have to go in 30 minutes tonight. The children are eager to get funnel cakes at the corn maze, and I have to set up chairs. So I will have to go in about 30 minutes, but we have 30 minutes. So Chetan, please.
I maybe quickly sort of maybe continue with that discussion in that sense. So last time, basically, what I think maybe are getting at is, last time we sort of discussed this question of economics from the perspective of how sort of individual enters this economic system, selling of the labor power and that discussion of market and so on. I think today we are sort of seeing this question from the perspective of the state. How the state look at this problem? In some senses, and I think that's the broad questioning that I think is going in that direction. I think one of the things we forget with statecraft actually is very I think interesting, that we forget that state emerged from a conflict between the king and the law. We do not understand that history too well, but essentially king used to use the law such that it could stop taking responsibility for its own decisions. That is how law started sort of expanding into the sphere of the king. And that is how sovereignty started getting divested. And usually that problem emerged because king was always in conflict with religion. Again, we don't understand. We think king and religion are one in that fantasy. It never was. King needed the law such that it could expand its power over other realms. And it could do that because it could stop taking the responsibility for its own decisions. He would say, law says this. And when the law says it, then the king can say, it's not my fault. And it is in that manner that law sort of allows this sort of expansion of realms in different, and it is in that context that the most convenient form of this law always demands certain form of legitimacy from the population. The more you use the law, the more population legitimacy is needed. That's a basic structure. Because basically you're using the law because you don't want to say I'm doing it. You want to say the law is doing it. And for law to be doing it, law needs that legitimacy in that sense. The other side of this legitimacy always was economics, because without economics, this legitimacy is not possible. Without integrating the population into certain kind of marketplace, this legitimacy of law was never possible. And eventually we know the story that as law expanded, it eventually expanded into the realm of the king itself. And the king got eaten up by law, and that's democracy. That's the point of demos in that sense that emerges, and so on and so forth. But this story in this sense always dependent upon this underbelly of economics through which law gained its legitimacy, which is why economics always has this link with this, whenever economic realm starts sort of shrinking, the strongman question starts emerging in some senses, which is why all strongmen come on the back of economics. And this is a very interesting sort of to and fro that goes on. It is in that story that something like state emerges, because state emerges at the point of inflection where king itself sort of slips under the measure of the law, and state becomes the way through which now this form of government, which is why when we talk about alternate world orders, we don't realize what is at stake in this discussion, because it's a very, very precarious world order that we live in that sense. We are very, structured way. You move one thing, we don't know what's going to happen. And these conditions were happening at a point where relationship between different states were directly a relationship of law. And as relationship of violence, I'm sorry. And as law started sort of, playing its role in some senses, we started realizing that now that violence will be negotiated with law between different nation states. Although in international law is not the same as national law, all of those discussions we can have. But essentially that, and again, the integration of different states had to happen through economics, just like in the case of population. So state looks at economics through this very precarious lens of social order. And we don't realize this. State realizes that without this link of economics, social order will not be maintained. And which is why I said violence is the central question there. For state, it's not so much a question of whether we can whether we have a good theory of value or not. For state, it's a question of what theory of value can actually help us attain social order that we're seeking. It's a reverse question. That is why value is always a problem for economics. State is not looking for an adequate theory of value. If it was, we would have had it. It's not that difficult. The problem essentially was it's looking for a theory of value that helps it attain this kind of social order, a geopolitical matrix that we are living in. And that theory of value is always evasive. As I think Alenka Zupančič got it right. Modern economics is essentially a problem of how do you exploit the gap. If earlier formal structures was how you cover the gap. Modern economics is not trying to cover the gap, it's trying to exploit it. It's trying to directly exploit it, which is why when you delink even money from gold, and you look at this problem from the perspective of state, for state, the fiction of economics itself is not clear. They don't know where fiction exists because they can create money anytime they want to. They don't even know what is the nature of that fiction. They work in very conservative ways because they actually don't know what will happen if they do one thing. Hard economics is a very strange problem in today's time. If they say they move interest rates in one direction, nobody is sure in what ways that thing will affect in different, So essentially, economics becomes an extremely conservative affair because the underlying economics lies no foundational mechanism or frictions through which there will be a natural way to curb that problem. We know once the ball starts rolling in economics, we don't know where it's going to stop. Once you make a decision and the ball starts rolling, there's nobody. So that's I think one way to maybe think about this. Maybe, and I'm sorry I took too long. Yeah.
You did not take too long. Everything you said was spot on. I'll give it to Dimitri. I'm going to just tap on what you just said at the end. I think it's exactly right that the state doesn't want an adequate theory of value because that allows it to keep going back and forth between, say, I'll just say conservative and liberal economics, back and forth in the dialectic. If they moved into speculative reason per se, that would unveil that they don't have an adequate theory of value and their power and legitimacy would be lost. So what they're doing is a game of this debate between the liberal and the conservative economic theory, which, because it maintains a fiction that economy is there from which they derive their legitimacy. And there's a way in which the economy now functions as a source of legitimacy in the same way that like God did for the king, because even though you had the two swords and like the Protestant Reformation between the king and the Pope, they both legitimized one another in that split. And in fact, that split occurred so they could legitimize one another. And that's why when you get into A Man of All Seasons and Thomas More, it's so fascinating, and Ziegler and et cetera, so forth. But you see the king to me, what's fascinating is the movement from the English Civil War, where the king and law was split, and then the American Civil War, where the question of law and state was split. Now, this is a massive claim, but to me, it's big because then under Lincoln, the notion of the Union actually is over the Constitution and law, and it becomes this existing kind of dimension, even if it doesn't follow the direct legal, like the Union is pre-existing of the states, for example. So there's this very interesting movement in America where king and law is split, then law or state are split, And yet the legitimacy of that state requires the law, which requires the economics. And you have this very strange kind of pathology. It would require a lot, you can get into Gary Gallagher, Shelby Foote, all the Civil War people, but you get this very strange pathological nation state at the end that hides its pathology through a fiction of economics that only works if you don't move to speculative reason about it. So then it's all a performance to keep it in that realm, to legitimate the power structure. Because but here's my theory, here's my claim, and then I'll give it to Dimitri. The amount of time that fiction can last without self-effacing, there is an expiration date. And it follows the Great Stagnation. It follows the falling growth rates. It leads to falling birth rates. It's not sustainable. But the problem is the state will not go down easy. They won't give up that fiction quickly, and they will make it as sustainable as long as possible. But I do not believe it is sustainable. And I'm not trying to be, I'm trying to make an argument that's not just say game A is, going to kill us all and we need a game B kind of thing, even though I think there's legitimacy to that. I think you need, for me, yes, you can talk about the fragility of the power grid, all of that stuff that game A critiques are, and there's legitimacy. But what I would like to put attention on is the expiration date of an economic system that does not erase the fiction, as you so well worded it there, Chetan, to get to the problem of demand. But in order to get to the hard problem of demand, you would have to remove the source of legitimacy of the nation state, and they're not going to do that so easily. But I think the language of economics as fiction is very well put. And I think also the King Law comment you made, and it opens the door to studying the English Civil War. Then I think the American Civil War is also quite interesting for this. And then also the last thing I was going to say is the system today is absolutely based on violence in the sense that it's a result of America taking advantage of Britain after Bretton Woods. We forced the war debts on Britain, didn't pay them as we thought to, and it made the dollar the global reserve currency. There is absolutely a violence that is behind the monetary system and reserve currency. It is not a everyone wins negotiation. No. The dollar was able to become the world reserve currency through some pretty messed up crap at Bretton Woods, if you ask me. And so there's always a kind of violence, even if it's not on the face of it, it's between the politicians on circling debt on other people, et cetera, and so forth. More can be said. Let me pass it to Dimitri and then Mr. Luber. Dimitri, please.
Yeah, Luber, Mr. Luber, can you repeat your question about the child?
Oh, right. If everybody becomes a child, then what becomes of the child, essentially? If everybody essentially is the child, then our understanding of what the child was so before everybody became a child, there's a notion of what the child is. And then let's just say everybody then becomes that notion. Then what happens to the notion of the child? In theory, there would be a new notion that would exceed the notion that everyone arrived at. And
are you talking about Nietzsche, the Nietzschean child?
Yeah, Daniel was.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm. If everybody becomes a Nietzschean child, then there has to be a new conception of the Nietzschean child in a certain sense. Was the point that I was getting at. So it always pushes the idea, the truth always kind of jumps in front of you, and then you kind of have to chase it. And then once you get there, it jumps in front of you. That type of imagery is what I was playing with.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, but this is, you get. I know we're talking about economics, but I cannot say anything sensible about it, so I'll just talk about something else. There's a similarity here between, the Nietzschean child and the idea about absolute knowing, and also I tried to bring it out in the same way with my last article about the soul that regrows its wings, because in a sense, it's not. It's it looks like it's something in the distance that you will get at in a linear kind of way if you do this thing, right? If you go through the camel and the lion, you go to the child. But just like absolute knowing, it's very ambiguous, and it's I don't know if it's correct to talk about it in a kind of sociological way of hey, can we all go through this process and then become the Nietzschean child, and then we are in that state, and then things fundamentally reorganize or restructure around that the new form of collective of the child. Maybe there's something to be said for it, and there's probably value to going into thinking what that such a thing kind of would mean. But it's weird, you know, like you can, if you say, hey, I'm an absolute knower, hey, I'm a Nietzschean child, like what the hell are you talking about? That would be so ridiculous. Or it's like those people who say I'm dignified or something, like I'm trustworthy. You know, if I'm trustworthy, I wouldn't say to you this kind of stuff. So there's something ridiculous about this, but there's also something ridiculous about saying like, oh, look, this guy's really a Nietzschean child. Look, this guy's really an absolute knower. So you see, like, I think these notions are meant to have this unease about them, and in this sense, they are really similar to God and the unease that the image or the notion of God should express. And I think that's basically one of the moves that someone who believes in God does versus someone who says, like, there's atheists who say, well, I don't really feel, God as a notion feels alien to me, so I don't take it up. To me, for me, like, this unease of your relationship to God is intrinsic to the very notion of God and that alienation that it entails. Now, what exactly is this? I don't know. And there's a very interesting move that Zizek makes, and it's actually connecting to a point I made ages ago in this talk about the sophist and Plato. And my hypothesis is that Heidegger is also guilty of it, although I have to read more Heidegger. The idea that if you make distinctions too early on, it can really show that you're retreating and like de-radicalizing or covering over something. So, for example, what Plato does in the Sophist, instead of staying with that rigorous dialectic of being and non-being and motion and rest and all the contradictions which spring out of it, he says, oh, well, let's just step back and make a bunch of distinctions so we can get settled and like basically, have an ontology that's settled so we can make sense of what a sophist is and what such a thing as an opinion or an appearance of being is. And Zizek will say the same thing about the notion of freedom and the notion of love. And he will say that the notion of freedom and love both have an ambiguity about it. I believe it was Isaiah Berlin, but I don't remember who we talked about, like positive and negative freedom, this idea of this this kind of stuff. But Zizek doesn't really like this because, well, of course there's a use to it, but freedom as a notion with its ambiguity can also be the power of its notion. So to let it stay in that ambiguity and to write about it and think about it in such a way has something to it. So I think the same is probably the case with something like absolute knowing. It's not that we should make, okay, well, there's it's an ambiguous notion. Let's have different types of absolute knowing. Let's have absolute knowing 1, 2, 3, 4, and like Nietzsche and child. So it's weird, you know. It's weird when you start thinking about things in this sense that the ambiguity actually has something to it, and it's about staying with that very ambiguity and letting and also about love. So love is also one of those ambiguous notions that you can make distinctions, but then actually you destroy something about the ambiguity that is there to express something important.
100%. So the notion of childhood that I'm discussing, I try to argue through Belonging Again, part 1, and it's about the ability, it has a whole lot to do with the ambiguity, the loss of the ground of values, and yet you're still able to live according to values because it goes through Philip Reeve, Peter Berger, and all the sociologists to show that you don't have the givens that become the background of sociological organization. And most people, when they lose that background, undergo a deconstruction, a release. I've talked with Mr. Murphy about it. I had a wonderful time talking with him again the other day. So Mr. Murphy, you're great. Glad you're here while driving your car. It's really wonderful. And if you get pulled over, let us talk to the police. They'll leave you alone, we promise. We'll just start talking about it. Also, you mentioned Heidegger, Dimitri. Luber literally has every Heidegger book tattooed on his back. So it's really small. If you have a lens, you can see it. It's great, like Sherlock Holmes. But like the child is someone of whom is precisely in a state of attention, and a child does not think themselves as a child. This is what's very strange. What is required today is being intentional about spreading something that is unintentional, organic, and emergent. Well, what the frick does that mean, and how do you do it? Well, if you cannot do it, then the only way you can spread is to be totalitarian and oppressive. So what are we talking about? We're talking about the spreading of the conditions of a garden. What does that mean? Well, if we can't figure it out, then we're stuck in the great stagnation that I think is inevitably going to lead to a lot of trouble in terms of social unrest, world war, blah, blah, blah. That ambiguity is, I think, a reason why the child does not fall into zero-sumness, because it is not something you think yourself as. It is a metaphoric term for someone who can be intrinsically motivated or find values when you don't have a background of values, which always has a particular individuating principle. It would actually mean that everyone is their own storyteller, honestly, Mr. Luber. If everyone is their own storyteller operating according to theme, does that mean everyone's story is less a story and less thematic because everyone else is doing it? I don't think so. I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I think it's a non-zero-sum game. Now, the question is, how can this occur without leading to conflict? Well, that's where we have to also revisit democracy, capitalism, new pricing mechanisms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of questions that have to be open there. But ultimately, belonging again, one has to end with a question of the possibility of the average person being someone of whom can thrive given the new sociological state. And Dimitri, thank you for being here. I will have to run in about 15 minutes as well. But as we come on the close for final comments, this ambiguity is key. And the reason why, for me, the economics argument is so strong is because if we can make the argument in belonging again, one, that society is essentially incomplete in a Gödel sense, but then we can also argue that economics is incomplete in a Gödel sense, then the failures of sociology or society cannot simply use economics to fill in the gap. No, there's a deeper level we have to go here, which is this non-philosophical realm where we're talking about lack in the human and the child in the Nietzschean sense. And that is the argument I'd like to make. And it's to the point where, like, Chetan is like, the state has used economics as a legitimacy. Well, likewise, basically, society has been able to hide its essential incompleteness via economics. Well, we're removing that plausible deniability. So it's opening up the abyssal, because I believe if we don't face the abyssal, then the great stagnation will get worse and worse, which benefits the upper class, leads to economic inequality, monopolies, all these other pathologies, in which you get social unrest that makes problems quite high. So to me, it's important to make economics abyssal as well, not because economics is invalid, but because this fundamental basis of it is trans-economic, and we have to think about it. If we don't do that, then people are simply going to cover over the problems brought out in belonging again by appealing to economics. So that has to be the first leg in the address before moving to the state, blah, 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 blah. But let me give it to Mr. Luber, Chetan, and then Mr. Tyler Murphy as we come to the close. Mr. Luber, please.
So I totally understand, like, what's being said. I just want to say the paradox of the Nietzschean child, like, I feel as if I really understand, and how that relates to the absolute knower. It's, if everybody is striving to understand their limit, essentially, what happens is, if everybody is in that same paradigm where they themselves have their own orientation to their limit, and they're operating according to that orientation to that limit, and how it moves in accordance to, you know, being in the world, at that very moment is precisely the moment that being will start to be forgotten. Meaning, the understanding of conceptual tools or conceptual mediations of that in-between space of how kind of being unfolds out of that tension of basic, that in between space of understanding your limit, and how that's fundamentally this game of going back and forth, Lacan stuff. I just think you can't escape that forgetting of being, and people start not orienting themselves to that limitation, and therefore like understanding that issue is what I'm focused on, insofar as when I say, like, if everybody becomes the child, like, then what does the child mean? It's everybody striving to be their own child, essentially, and not being aware of it, just whatever it means to orient yourself to that paradigm. Because there could be so much said in how you orient yourself in the Nietzschean child paradigm. The point isn't necessarily how you orient yourself, but just the point of, if everybody has that orientation. So one, that's how it has to do with civilization as a whole, because everybody has their own orientation to their limit. The question is, if you're intentionally gearing it and everybody's doing it, my claim is just that at that point, you'll be forgetting how to do it at a certain point. It's the start. I forget what I was going to say with that, but I got it. Sorry, real quick. Just that if you see life, like what Chetan's saying, as as a fiction, then you can understand basically the forgetting as part of like, you can see that in the forgetting, there's actually something to then orient yourself to kind of double down in the forgetting. Like, you're striving to kind of forget, but you're forgetting in a way that's not, negative, in the sense that it's just like effacing. It's like you're forgetting in a way for you to be able to remember again. And like, in that sense, that's the key move. And that's where I feel like the storyteller part can come in, because it's just, it kind of can train you to, it's like a necessary forgetting for the sake of remembering and having. That, just close with that.
No, extremely important. Right now, being is being forgotten. The movement to the child would be that you would locate being in the apathetic, and therefore you would not have it, but it would not be forgotten. It would be the same practical state. But right now, what it is that being is forgotten because of the collective. What has to occur is the location of being in the apathetic, or I'll talk about the fate of beauty. It's the movement of being as forgotten as being as mystery. Like right now, where it's forgotten, you lose it. But if you locate being in mystery, you don't have it either, but it's a different kind of not having. It's a different kind. It's the difference between an effacement and a negation sublation. And this is why also another part of belonging, again, too, has to be the fate of beauty. The fate of beauty is the fate of us, and it's the movement of beauty it's the movement of being into the apathetic, which you could also say the lack of the human being. Like we're saying with a child, is this playing of the lack, movement to the lack from scarcity and economics. Because then what ends up happening is, yes, everyone loses being again, but it's not forgotten. It's given up into the apathetic. So you're ever getting, but never getting complete me. So your orientation to being shifts from being something that you forget to something you don't have, because you're always getting in that apathetic relation. It's a very important thing, but that is the change in kind, to be more precise. Like right now, the kind of being we are is a being of whom forgets being. What has to occur is we have to shift to a being who doesn't have being, because it's apathetic. It is always something ever approaching. That's a different kind of ontology, if you will, not a different degree of the ontology we occur. And the argument I am making is that that is going to be at the heart of addressing the hard problem of economics, as strange as it may sound. And also not doing that, the other thing is, you're talking about the forgetting. That's neoliberalism, or you get everyone going into their own Dasein, like Dugin talks about in the fourth political theory. And we're trying to address the problem of, dare I say, neoliberalism without an isolationist strategy or a succession strategy. Those strategies work, but I'd like to look at something alternative. I would like to not talk about multiple Daseins and Duginism and different things. Although there's a point there if we cannot make this transition. So that'd be the first thing I'd say.
Okay. All right. I just really, all I wanted to say was, people get their jouissance in various ways. Some people love to buy the labor power of lots and lots of people and make huge profits proportional to themselves off of that. I myself just enjoy, like, how many jouissance things can I stack on while I'm driving down the road. So like I was eating some McDonald's earlier, having a big gulp. And then, of course, I get to also bring in the net. So anyways, thanks for, just being part of my jouissance as I drive across Montana today. I hope I wasn't too distracting, kind of popping in and out. Or maybe I do hope that I was distracting, because that's another way I get jouissance is got to have some recognition in various ways. So anyways, just enjoyed the conversation. I'm pretty far, like economics is kind of above my pay grade, but I do have some thoughts though on, like, just even thinking of economics in the terms of arbitrage, and thinking of labor power as itself a commodity that, people, like my friend who owns a roofing and siding business goes out, buys the hourly wage of 5 guys for $30 an hour, multiply that by 5 guys in the crew, multiply the crew by 5, all of a sudden now he's got 25 times what one person makes. And I've been wondering if is that similar? Would that be like sort of tying into Marx's critique of labor power, that understanding of things? Anyways, that's all. Thanks for letting me listen in today.
Well, first off, we love you. Thank you for letting us be there with you as you enjoyed your big gulp and drove across the country. So well done to you, sir. The question you are asking is certainly something that Marx would have it would basically be saying value is a result of surplus, of which is only possible because of the workers, and their surplus is being stolen. Now, that would have to get us into the critiques of that notion, and then people would be like, well, the only reason there's surplus is because the guy creates the job where there could be surplus, and then, like, he had to take on the risk, and this gets us into that giant debate. And then, of course, it's the question of the ethics. If someone agrees to having their surplus value sold, does that make it okay? But what if they have no choice to be agreed? And we go on. And that's where the economic debate has a lot of validity. And certainly, when I'm critiquing economics as ultimately abyssal, I'm not saying there shouldn't be debates on policy or particular regulations or law. I mean, I think there are, for example, does minimum wage cause youth unemployment to go up? That seems to be an empirical question. You might be able to do those studies, and you have to decide, do you think that it's good to have, kids working for maybe $7 an hour, or is it better for them not to work and to be in school? Well, those are policy decisions. So there are policy questions that have to be approached, because it does seem that minimum wage causes youth unemployment, but that's not necessarily a bad thing based on what your metric is, right? So you have to get into all that. So the question of surplus value would have to be given that analysis, but the point you're getting at is very valid, and you were not distracting at all, because you coming in and out is exciting. It was exciting to see you come and go. So I'll give it to Chetan as we come to the close, and I prepare to go get lost in a corn maze with the children and then unfold chairs. Chetan, please.
Hi, I just quickly say that, discussing this childhood question, actually, one should not get too obsessed with Nietzschean child when we're thinking about modern state. The reason being, we don't realize this, but modern state is hinged upon controlling childhood in many ways. So if everybody becomes an Eastern child, there's no state possible anyway. The point is that state lies long time back, that child is a figure which can't be controlled directly through law. And it always seeks to have this child-elect relationship vis-a-vis its citizenship. So law always had this underbelly where child was always this back image, Lacanian image, you may call this background in which citizenship was formed. So the more emphasis upon childhood, the more state sort of starts becoming powerful. So child has this dark side. And if you look at the consumerism question, we normally think of economics to produce production, but if you think of the economics to the question of consumerism, you realize that this exploitation of desires, this control through desires in that sense, emerges because there is an image of the child working in the background. That is how childhood is conceived in modern family structures in many ways. There's a link between childhood and this form of control through certain liberal economy. How do we understand that? It's almost like a father telling a child, you can go and have your ice cream and so on and forth. And I'm not, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this is the traditional father-son relationship that state is looking at. It's not. It's not simple patriarchal relationship. You have to be very honest about it. But yet the figure of the child looms large in this relationship between citizenship and state. What is that figure all about? And how that figure can get activated at various points of time. That's, I think, maybe first point. And second, I think, coming back to the question of law and the question of civil American, we forget law always functions through its exception. This incompleteness we're talking about, law in some senses always knew it's incomplete, and law always knew that to function, it had to stand on its own exception in that sense. So our government has this very famous theory where he sort of argues that there's something called force of law and content of law. So even when content of law is suspended, the force of law can still be activated. So it's not like when law is functioning to its exception, we know law is not working. We still think it's the law that is functioning, even when law is suspended. That's the fascinating point. That's where you have to think about American Civil War. So it wasn't the case when Lincoln, for instance, sort of suspended law and so on and so forth, that the force of law was absent. The very union of states was achieved through force of law, even when the content of law was missing. And that's the tricky bit with law we have to think about in today's time. That law is not simply its content anymore. It's this ephemeral thing which remains active even when the content is missing. So even if somebody comes up and they'll tell you something completely arbitrary, and that becomes a certain kind of a legal dictum for you. How does that happen? And how does that gain legitimacy? Our government has this very, very nice, brilliant book called State of Exception for that. I think the last point is about violence. Maybe we can do it next time sometime, but this is, I think, interesting questions to think about. So I'm just talking too much. Yeah.
You are not talking too much. Everything it was outstanding. I think that's exactly right. When everyone's like, oh my gosh, Lincoln suspended the newspapers and habeas corpus and all these different things. But the idea is that the union is the law. It's like it can't break the law, because it kind of, in a way, is the justice that makes law possible. And you have this interesting point. Please, Chetan.
Yeah, I'm just saying, even the suspension of the newspaper and all of that stuff was done through law.
Yeah, exactly.
They were legal decrees. They could not have done without law in that manner. It was not like a king decree.
Well, you're getting at something so important, because in the same way, I think we really want to examine the breaks to base thought. So for example, Biden just forgave a bunch of student loan debt. There's a lot of people who are like, that's unconstitutional. And yet, how did he do it? He did it through law. So what is law in this moment of ambiguity between the Supreme Court decision and when it's enacted? Is that not law? What is that in this ambiguous space, right? Well, that's the nature of the new state. That's what we have to put our finger on. And I think it becomes very fascinating when you examine or read Justice Scalia's books on law versus Stephen Meyer or Ginsburg and all these different people, on the idea that no, the justice is not in the business. Judges are not in the business of justice, but in law. But Ginsburg is like, well, what is law? But the legitimacy of law is based on justice. So what are we talking about? But what's interesting is this question and problem cannot come to the forefront if you don't examine the breakpoints. Like right now, when Biden forgives all the student loan, it's enacted, it's going, well, the courts may overturn it. Yes, but it's enacted right now. What is this thing that's enacted that may be or may not be overturned? It's a raw kind of, is it law? Is it raw power? Putting your finger on this, I think, starts getting at the nature of the state today. In the same way that we can examine questions of freedom and determinism when somebody asks you to do something you don't want to do, and you have to make the decision on what you say to them. Then you feel your freedom taken when they ask you to go to the movies and you don't want to go. Likewise, the strangeness of law arises precisely in these times where something occurs that may be unconstitutional and yet still has force before it is so ruled. What is that? I think I think the way you described that was really, really well put. I will have to go, alas. I've enjoyed speaking. Thank you all, dear friends. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day. And thank you for your time. Chetan, Tyler, Andrew, you're magnificent. Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
So, thank you. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Best to it. Thank you, wonderful ones.